762 Watt 51 M993 AP tungsten core. Introduced in the 1990s as a U.S. service armor-piercing load. The M993 pairs 7.6251 NATO dimensions with a tungsten carbide core. NAMO appears in open materials connected to supply, and the round's roll sits squarely in the post-Cold War push for small-caliber plate defeat. The projectile weighs about 128 grains and leaves the muzzle near 930 meters per second, and the manufacturer's dispersion spec SD no greater than 200 mm at 550 mid places it among the more precise AP offerings of its time. Penetration figures quoted for the type include roughly 18 mm of RHA at 100 mirs and measurable plate defeat at 500 mirs, which maps to typical anti-materiel and heavy body armor tasks. Construction is straightforward, a hard penetrator, and an envelope shaped to maintain stability and sectional density through impact. Service descriptions call it combat-proven and note a lead-free variant intended for modern environmental requirements. Civilian pricing appears only in small trickles. One representative dealer listing showed a 19-piece lot sold just under $1,000 after discounting, which works out to roughly $50 per projectile. Single pieces have been offered around the mid-two-figure mark. Sales tend to move through specialist classifieds rather than ordinary retail channels, and export or possession rules can apply depending on jurisdiction. Minuteman Ammo Werewolf Defense Line. The Werewolf cartridge is a contemporary boutique .45 autoload that uses a 99.9% pure silver projectile seated in nickel-plated Starline brass. Minuteman's copy describes hand finishing to tight tolerances and claims deformation behavior comparable to monolithic copper designs, with a brief nod to gelatin testing visible in another caliber. The product is shipped as a single live round in a small engraved rosewood casket, which is part of the concept as much as the projectile itself. A single round sits around the mid-hundreds, not because of uncommon propellant or a patented shape, but because precious metal content, handwork, and packaging are the point. Orders run on a maker-quoted lead time of several business days, and the purchase page includes detailed state-by-state eligibility instructions. The firm presents it as fully functional in pistols, revolvers, and pistol-caliber carbines. Independent ballistic coefficients or third-party terminal data are not provided in the material at hand. This places it in the crossover space between functional ammunition and collectible object. Typical buyers encounter it directly through the manufacturer rather than dealers, and production volume is intentionally small. Storage and handling follow normal centerfire practice. The unusual element is the silver slug rather than a new internal hazard. Counter 600 Nitro Express. Jeffrey & Company introduced the 600 Nitro Express at the turn of the 20th century for dangerous game at close distance. The cartridge fires a 620-inch, roughly 900-grain projectile from a 3-inch rimmed case, originally in cordite loadings that produced about 1,850 to 2,050 FOS and muzzle energies in the upper 6 to mid 8,000 foot-pound range. Rifles intended for it were built heavy, often around 16 pounds, to control recoil during repeatable field shots. The design brief was simple, decisive penetration and straight-line momentum in thick cover, where a follow-up mattered less than stopping power. Wartime procurement reached for large-bore sporting rifles when needed. Accounts mention British use against steel plates employed by German snipers in the First World War. Production totals remained modest across the classic period, and later estimates from makers suggest only on the order of 100 original rifles existed by the early 21st century. Modern commercial loads keep the cartridge alive in small runs. A 5-round box from a contemporary maker has been listed at $200 when in stock, which places individual rounds just under $50 each. Rare branded boxes and provenance-rich lots at auction can sit materially higher on a per-round basis. In the United States, the cartridge falls under destructive device rules, so import and transfer require ATF paperwork. Practical notes from historical sources remain relevant: heavy rifles, upright shooting positions, and attention to technique prevent injuries that looser positions invite. Raufoss Mk211, Norway's multi-purpose 50 caliber projectile marketed by Nammo as NM140MP, combines a tungsten penetrator, a low brisance explosive, and an incendiary component behind a conventional jacket. The Mk211 entered service in the early 1980s and was designed to punch through initial barrier layers and then initiate, producing a forward cone of fragments and heat. It appears both in anti-materiel rifles, such as the Barrett M82, and in M2 Browning belts, where specific targets call for it. Publicly available performance notes cite plate defeat at distance. One source gives roughly 11 mm of RHA at 45 degrees at 1,000 meters, and consistent post-penetration energetic effects. While potent for a caliber commonly thought of as a heavy machine gun round, the Mk211 is not a counter to main battle tank weapon. Modern tanks have composite and spaced armors well beyond the capability of .50 caliber projectiles. In practice, the round is effective against soft-skinned and lightly armored vehicles and against vulnerable external components, optics, sensors, fuel systems, and other exposed fittings where incendiary and fragmenting effects can degrade or deny a vehicle's combat function without breaching heavy armor. Dealer listings for single rounds have sat around $90 and up, with some variance by packaging and source. Availability outside institutional channels is narrow, often restricted to demilitarized offerings and jurisdictions where shipment is permitted. Most trade moves through licensed vendors with explicit shipping policies, and buyers are generally reminded to confirm local rules before purchase. The use case remains specific hard targets, fuel ignition potential, and systems configured to exploit it. 700 Nitro Express. Holland developed the 700 Nitro Express in the mid-1980s after a client asked for a cartridge larger than the 600. The new round fires a 1,000 grain bullet at roughly 2,000 Futsien, which produces muzzle energy close to 9,000 foot-pounds. Recoil energy near 160 foot-pounds was recorded during development, which forced heavy double rifles, substantial brakes, and careful regulation. Development involved direct patron involvement. William Bill Feldstein funded the project and took part in testing, reportedly firing dozens of rounds while the maker finalized regulation and load. An exhibition-grade Royal Double with deep engraving and gold inlay served as the showpiece and toured events as part of the maker's Brevis collection. The combination of bespoke rifles, limited ammunition runs, and the brand's position created a cartridge that is as much an artifact as a field tool. Single cartridges have been listed from $80 to $120, and original maker's boxes with inserts show higher aggregate numbers. Shipping is quoted separately even for a single round or a boxed set, which reflects the retail reality of micro-production. The ammunition itself remains conventional in construction solids and softs, suited for very large game without an explosive component. Ownership sits with collectors and a small number of hunters who commission or maintain rifles at this scale. 20 110mm Hispano aircraft cannon rounds. The Hispano Suiza HS-404 and its relatives used the 20 110mm cartridge in the Second World War, an aircraft gun round with projectile options ranging from semi-armor piercing incendiary to high explosive incendiary. Complete rounds weigh on the order of a quarter kilogram, and muzzle velocities around 840-80 mph are typical for aerial gunnery. The mix of projectile designs let air forces choose between ignition of fuel systems, structural damage, or limited plate defeat in frontal aspects. Sales data rarely separates ammunition cleanly from mounts and spares. A restored HS-404 cannon with 1,000 rounds was offered at $24,950. Simple division puts the ammunition near $25 per piece inside that bundle, though the cannon itself clearly absorbed a portion of the price. The same listing quoted approximately £2,000 for the ammunition lot, which conflicts with per-round weights in reference sources and illustrates how provenance and documentation can vary in historic ads. Modern movement tends toward inert examples and deactivated display pieces. Explosive fillers in HE and SAPI types bring demilitarization and transport rules into play, so most private sales route through specialist historic weapons dealers who can document status. Museums and dedicated collectors remain the main holders of functional remnants, and the Rounds History Aircraft Service, recovery stories, and factory packaging often matters as much as ballistics when prices are negotiated. 950 JDJ. Jones created the 950 JDJ as a shoulder-fired extreme in the modern era, building it from a shortened 20 by 102 mm Vulcan case necked to .950 inch. Projectiles commonly weigh about 3,600 grains and are launched near 2,200 feet, which pushes energy into the light autocannon bracket. Rifles that chamber it use very thick Krieger barrels, multi-pound brakes, and overall weights from roughly 85 to well over 100 pounds to keep the platform shootable. Production numbers remained vanishingly small. Contemporary notes point to only 3 rifles built, and by the mid-2010s, loaded ammunition was no longer being produced by the original shop. Some online listings show 950 JDJ 225,000, but the entry doesn't make clear whether that refers to a complete cartridge, a case, or another part. Other seller notes place typical per-shot pricing nearer to $40, which reflects the market's thinness and the frequent ambiguity in public listings. Ownership in the United States relied on a sporting use exception, so the rifles could transfer like ordinary Title I firearms rather than NFA items. Range practice for the platform is entirely practical shooters, employ heavy rests or sleds and long eye relief to avoid injury from the violent recoil cycle. The cartridge survives now as an engineering outlier that appears in private collections, videos from controlled demonstrations, and occasional component sales rather than as a repeatable field tool. Gyrojet M2A1 flare ammo. MB Associates persisted with rocket-propelled micromunitions longer than most, and the Model 207 and M2A1 personal distress kits represent the concept at its most practical. These 13mm rockets are finless. Angled exhaust ports impart spin while the rocket accelerates after leaving the launcher. Contemporary descriptions for the flare variant place the initial launch to a few hundred feet before ignition, with several seconds of light measured in thousands of lumens, and some sources noting possible reach to around 1,500 feet. Surplus examples appear irregularly. Individual flares frequently show prices in the several tens of dollars range, and complete mint kits have been reported around $200. The manufacturing lineage runs through MBA into the early 1980s, with later similar kits produced by Security Signals Inc., and some variants restricted to military or law enforcement channels. The equipment is light because the tube serves primarily as an aiming guide. Thrust comes from the rocket, so recoil is minimal. Old stock can still function. Accounts of rockets firing decades after manufacture drive a recurring safety message in collector circles: treat every cartridge as live ordnance, keep clear of the exhaust, and avoid casual handling. Sales travel through surplus dealers, private collectors, and occasional auctions. Packaging, completeness, and provenance influence prices as much as the flare's technical details. Gyrojet 13mm rocket cartridges, BAs, and 13mm small arms rockets sit at the intersection of experimental engineering and collectible. Instead of a powder charge driving a bullet down a rifled tube, the cartridge is a self-contained rocket with angled nozzles for spin stabilization and a thrust curve that builds speed downrange. Performance is modest compared with contemporary firearm cartridges. The rockets were famously low recoil and lightweight. With reported velocities around 1,250 feet sauce at close range and an unconfirmed burnout energy figure in the neighborhood of a few hundred foot-pounds, accuracy was poor relative to rifled bullets, which, coupled with sensitivity to port fouling and humidity, helped doom the system commercially. The family included multiple calibers, factory errors, and experimental items that later acquired descriptive names from collectors, which means identical-looking rounds can represent different internal variants. A 24-round box sold at Rock Island auction for $738 including premium, which yields about $318 per round when divided evenly across the lot. Single 13mm rockets at dealers have been tagged between roughly $125 and $350 depending on type and condition, and unusual pieces factory error wad cutter rockets or rare nozzle configurations can push higher. Dummy 50 BMG case gyrojets have appeared in the high three-figure range per item. Pricing for live PAN-50 case versions was not stated in the provided material. Production ended decades ago and the company vanished, so every live shot today also erases a collectible. ATF rules over time influenced caliber choices and exemptions, and packaging can be a value driver on its own. The appearance of experimental two-piece plastic boxes around the 500+ mark illustrates how containers, labels, and condition affect collector math. Most trade routes through specialist dealers and collector forums, with occasional auction lots providing public price anchors that ripple into private sales. W48 155mm AFAP. The W48 is the largest conceptual step in this list. A 155mm nuclear artillery shell produced for U.S. service beginning in 1963 and retired by 1992. Sources cite a yield band between roughly 72 and 100 tons of TNT and an effective range of about 14 kilometers when fired from standard howitzers. A nuclear shell of such size in the roughly 72 to 100 ton TNT range is fairly small by nuclear standards and is closer in destructive energy to a very large conventional air-dropped bomb than to strategic thermonuclear devices. In practical terms, blast and thermal effects at that yield would be expected to devastate a compact urban neighborhood or a few city blocks, an area on the order of a few hectares. The engineering problem was as much survivability as miniaturization. The shell had to endure setback loads on the order of 9,000, 12,000 Joule and spin rates near 18,000 RPM, which led to specialized firing sets and long life capacitors. Dimensions reach 34 inches in length, 120 pounds in mass, and the nominal 155mm diameter. Documentation references work by UCRL and Sandia with Army testing at Yuma, and a Picatinny arsenal concept for a toroidal polystyrene capacitor intended to hold charge for years in storage. Production numbers vary by source, with mentions of more than 1,000 units built in total across Mod 0 and Mod 1. Cost appears in public sources as approximately $1.25 million per round during service life. That figure reflects warhead miniaturization, specialized materials, and the logistics framework required for nuclear artillery rather than a conventional ammunition price. Civilian ownership is uncommon, as retired examples usually reside in museums or government custody. As an outlier, the W48 defines the far edge of what ammunition can include in a historical survey built from commercial, military, and experimental entries. That brings us to the end of this video. Thank you for taking the time to watch. Your support makes it possible to keep exploring topics like this. If you'd like to see a particular subject covered in the future, feel free to leave a comment with your suggestion.